thank you all for being here. It's a panel on income inequality. I think it's the third or fourth year we've been doing one on inequality. We started with a debate as whether it was creating problems, and we now have moved to the thought that there are problems and we're going to try and find solutions. I see oh no, that's not up there. Okay, so actually, if we pull up chart one, just before I get to the thing, is one of the things when we talk about income inequality, sometimes the phrase gets people thinking different ways. So some of us have started talking about outcome inequality and saying, let's look at inequality in and of itself is not so much of an issue, but whether the quality of life for a population is strong and getting better or not. This is just a quick one. I don't want to spend time on it, but these are different surveys that have ranked problems in societies, and they rank them for the developed world. And it's interesting that the richest country in the world, if you look at where we rank, number one being the worst in the world. If we look at negative things for the quality of life for the people in a society, it's amazing how many times we rank very near the top of the worst of these outcomes for a society. So there's some things we're not doing as a society that what are the causes and how we get underneath it is what this panel is about. And I will tell you, we have a great panel because it takes a village to deal with these issues, and we have a lot of different points of view here for some very high-level people. They are so well known that they need no introduction, and therefore they shall not receive one. So we're going to jump right in.
Smart.
And I think I'm going to start, Darren, let's start with you, as the Ford Foundation has announced that its sole focus of the charity now is to combat income inequality. And that is really a powerful statement. And I'd like to know from your perception, focusing on the United States now, what are the things that caught your eye at the Ford Foundation and said, we've got to do something about it? What are the things that really grabbed you? And what are the few things, if you want to start with, that are the main ways to deal with the problems that you see that you want to take on?
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And I think when we engaged in this question of what should the Ford Foundation be focused on today, inequality emerged because our work at its core is about building a healthy, productive democracy in the United States. And we believe that the greatest threat to that is growing inequality, in part because at the heart of the American narrative is the idea of hope, aspiration, and mobility. That is the bedrock of our American civilization, and inequality is a pernicious threat to that. What we learned, though, was the different perspectives of those who we asked about what were the drivers of inequality. What we heard from experts were technical inputs. We heard about technology, automation, trade policy, labor capital. The conversation was like that. When we talked to average people, we heard a different set of drivers. They talked about drivers being persistent prejudice, cultural narratives that justify why some Americans are advantaged and others are disadvantaged, the rules of our economy working against them. They're feeling disaffected from the political system, which they no longer believe supports them, and a lack of investment in the public goods they depend on to be good citizens, good Americans. So that's why we decided to focus on inequality.
And just starting out, are there a few things that you've now decided to do, a couple of things that you think are main drivers at getting at, levers that from a philanthropic point of view you can have an impact on?
Sure, we have to focus on structures and systems which aren't sexy and which aren't fun. People like to talk about projects and individual inputs. The challenge here is that we have structures and systems that are increasingly hardwired for inequality in our society. And so we have to get at loosening the grip on our systems, whether that be our public school systems, our public park systems, our criminal justice system. These are the systems by which the rules are set in this country. And if they are inherently biased against some Americans and inherently favor and advantage other Americans, we have to address that head on.
That opens a lot of doors. I hope we'll get to go through some of them. But I'm going to jump out of order here because there's something you said that ties into something that I think Garrett has talked about. So Garrett, you started a not-for-profit and you were on the street, with inner city kids that had some real needs. And just hearing Darren talk about when you talk to average people, what do you hear instead of when you're up here in the clouds talking about from the experts. So what did you learn from your experience of working with these kids on the ground?
Yeah, so College Spring is a national nonprofit organization. We help 5,000 low-income youth annually be academically prepared for college and also connect them to mentors who support them on that path. And the thing I keep thinking about over and over again is how many kids we meet who just have a lack of hope and frustration about how things are right now, that if you're an African-American teenager in this country, you're twice as likely to have a relative who's gone to jail than who's graduated from college. And we don't really think about all the time what it's like to have, to be able to predict outcomes for yourself that are more likely that you won't succeed than the other way around. And if the average outcome for somebody in your position is to fail, it's very difficult to shake yourself out of that mentality and to believe that you can have something different for your own life. And it's exacerbated in a world in places like Silicon Valley where incomes for the bottom 20% are falling. So for kids who already feel like the odds are stacked against them, they hear about new millionaires being minted every day, and to see incomes falling in their neighborhoods, it's tough to go through that and feel like there's still hope and a reason to invest in yourself and the economy.
You know, there's a phrase that they use in mentoring saying you have to close the gap between aspiration and expectation, and that's what you're talking about, which is powerful. I want to pull up slide 2 here for a second. And I want to say, last year, for those of you who attended, we put this slide up to say, this is from the Durants, the great historians, that basically said if you get an unstable equilibrium where the people believe that it's not a fair system and things are not working, and we said, if you look at the outcomes, we were here to protect you from the guillotines. But if one wants to question, listening to Garrett, listening to Darren about how the average person is feeling about the way the game is being played here in the United States, one has to only look at the election results. If we pulled up slide 3. Legislation redistributing the wealth or revolution distributing poverty. There you see 2 leading candidates that are 2 sides of the same coin. So whether or not we think that the public thinks the game is fair, what we're hearing with people on the street is this is the beginning of people saying we have to push back against the system. So now, Sarah, the Urban Institute has written extensively on the impacts of inequality and especially on mobility. What is it that, the Urban Institute sort of started to focus on, or what caught your attention? And could you just start again a little bit like Darren? What are some of the things that we could do to maybe improve the outcomes?
Sure, thanks. And it's really a great pleasure to be here, especially with such a great group. At Urban, we've been thinking a lot about the challenge of mobility out of poverty. And in particular, the issue about mobility that really bedevils us is not that, and I think most of us would agree, it's not that absolute mobility in the United States is so much worse than it was 50 years ago. It is that, in fact, those who, although has gotten better in many other countries, and it hasn't gotten better here. My favorite line from Raj Chetty is that if you're really in search of the American dream, perhaps you ought to live in Canada. But in fact, what we've learned more and more is how much there's sort of stickiness. In other words, that inequitable access to mobility is the really profound problem. If you are poor, if you have a single-headed household, if you are black or brown in particular, and if you live in places of concentrated poverty, your opportunity, the chances are that your outcomes in life are going to be different than where you started, are far less than a similarly situated person, low-income person who doesn't have those factors. And so there are places we now understand that we think of as sinkhole communities, places where very, very few people have a better life. If you think about the Lower East Side in the turn of the century, that was a springboard neighborhood. Poor people arrived in the American shores and went into that community, and through it they got connected to others like them, and they built social networks, and they built opportunity. And my grandparents, and probably many other people, great-grandparents, many other people around this room, came through places like that. We have, particularly for low-income people of color in this country, deep concentrated poverty that is structural, and it makes it very hard for anyone to have opportunities. So we've launched an initiative called the U.S. Partnership for Mobility from Poverty with support from the Gates Foundation, a group led by David Elwood, 24 of the most extraordinary people from diverse things, from brain science and running NGOs in low-income communities and economists and others, to try to sort of find what are the big bets, what should we be working on. And a couple of the things we're thinking about, just briefly. The first is that place matters. We know that where you live has a lot to do. So how do you connect communities to opportunity? What are the kinds of multi-siloed strategies that are working in places where you can find somebody a job, but if they don't have anybody to take care of the kids, it's not going to work so well. Increasingly, people are working in cross-silo places, cross-silo strategies in particular places. We want to explore those better. How do you connect people to opportunity while you also make their communities better and give them a chance, if they choose, to move to better places? But also invest in those communities so those who stay have a chance. Second thing we're trying to understand better is the ways in which your brain works. Tells us a lot about what makes people stay and be stuck in poverty. We heard an example of that when you're talking about high school students. But living through the stress and trauma of poverty, living in a neighborhood where there are gunshots, living through a circumstance where you're watching your parents be dysfunctional in a moment of drug or alcohol abuse or violence, those experiences are searing to children, and they create stress. And we're learning a lot about how brains deal with that stress. And one of the things you learn is lack of ability to navigate through life. You make bad decisions yourself. So how do you make people resilient and work with them to support them through? And the third question that we're spending a lot of time thinking about is one that Darren already mentioned, which is the ways in which our society have built structural barriers, particularly structural racial barriers that prevent opportunity. In Silicon Valley, where Garrett has done a lot of his work, we recently did a study that showed that that community, one of the wealthiest in America, has a lot of poor, low-income immigrant kids. Their parents work for those companies and those families that have the privilege of benefiting from our economy. And those families, the 3-year-olds, vast proportion of them do not have access to preschool, whereas their wealthy equivalent in the same community, almost all of them have education when they're 3 and 4 years old. That starts at the very beginning, putting somebody, there's that slide that's up there about equity versus equality, and clearly if you go back to, I think it's, that one, thank you. We obviously aren't talking about a society where everyone is equal in all things, but if the kids start out from behind at age 3, it makes it much harder for those immigrant families to have a chance for their kids to get ahead.
Well, and the concept of place is only becoming more important because we have more and more economic segregation in society today. That I paid a lot of attention to my classmates at Stanford who are on full scholarships to see, what does it take for somebody from a low-income community to make it to an elite institution? And the common thread most of them have is they were connected to privilege and wealth in some way, that they may have come from a low-income family themselves, but they found access to a program, or they got a scholarship to a private high school, or whatever it may be. So access to these, access to wealth and privilege is helpful even if you come from a low-income low-income background. And as communities become more and more economically segregated, the concept of place is going to be more and more important in terms of moving the needle in these outcomes.
Well, it's very important. So there's a lot of social and cultural issues that have been shaping these outcomes, and we need to spend more time. But then I got to go to my fellow economists, even if we're boring, right, guys? So
Yeah.
I think because, look.
Let's get boring.
Let's get boring. Let's get boring.
Capital labor.
Let's talk productivity statistics. But the bottom line is we need economic growth to help deal with a lot of these issues. And so let me start with you, Doug. So, if we look at, coming out of the crisis, where U.S. economy is probably doing better than most in the world, right? And so we're seeing some growth, but there's a perception that the growth is very, very limited, or the benefits of the growth are very limited to a small percentage of the population. So what do you see as the main issue economically that the way we're doing things today is not working, and for what segments of the population?
Well, thanks for the chance to join this. I mean, most people assume economists are born without souls, so we don't get to talk in these circumstances. But and actually, I think that's been a great conversation, because when I first saw the title for this, moral issue, is this the moral issue of our time? My answer was no. I mean, to be honest, I think what we are leaving to the next generations in the way of debt, in the way of national security, and in the way of capacity for growth is a greater concern to me. But when you listen to the things that people are actually working on, they coincide with what I think we need to be doing right now, which is to worry about those folks at the low end of our society and give them better opportunities and abilities to get ahead, the mobility issues, worry a lot about poverty. And the growth is a big part of this. Here's a way to think about economic growth in the United States. From the end of World War II to 2007, the overall economy grew at a rate, 3.2%, fast enough that GDP per capita, income per person, a rough measure of the standard of living, doubled every 35 years. So in roughly one working career, you could imagine the capacity to attain the American dream, whatever that was for you. Send someone to college, buy a home, whatever it might be. We're now basically, most people believe the capacity to grow is capped at 2% over the long term. You combine that with projected population growth, the American dream is now 75 years away. That's how long it takes income per person to double. That's a big concern to me, to leave that behind. Inside that average, there's big issues in distribution. There's no doubt about it. But the fact that we don't have a rapidly growing economy has immediate manifestations. We've seen very stagnant wage growth, and real wages are not rising. We've seen the median household income decline in a recovery, unprecedented, and something to be deeply concerned about, in my view. And so it's not the magic elixir, but to have better top-line economic growth, to have policies that aim at that, are enormously important, and will ameliorate a lot of problems in the working class who have jobs but aren't getting a raise and are very frustrated about it and quite angry. But that won't solve the very bottom, right? These sort of sinkhole communities, the places where I think we need to fundamentally rethink our strategies toward poverty. Poverty is typically defined as a lack of money, a lack of material resources, and that just suggests the solution is to throw money at it, and it hasn't worked and won't work. It's about self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency comes with an intricate dance between the capacity to work and to do well and the opportunity to work and do well. And in too many places, people with capacity don't get opportunity, people who have opportunities don't have the capacity, and in the worst places, neither are present. And we ought to be thinking very hard about those issues.
So, thank you, Doug. So, Jared, taking that and staying on the economic side of this, if we do things to help the bottom, if we get better safety nets and better skill sets and better, training, et cetera, is that going to, really ameliorate the problem? Or some people would argue, Jared, I think, that even before growth slowed down, as Doug is talking about, we started to see, even in decent growth periods like the 90s, where the share of the gains going to labor versus capital was beginning to get skewed, and then the slowdown really exacerbates that. And I think that may be something that you might want to focus on.
Definitely. I'm very much subscribe to the idea that growth is, of course, necessary, but by definition, really not sufficient to solve or very much ameliorate this problem, because we've actually had long periods of GDP growth where the growth was, of course, concentrated to those at the top of the scale, and that is really the definition of inequality. Now, it is the case that when GDP grew more quickly, the real earnings of people in the middle and the bottom grew more quickly as well in the latter 1990s. But that didn't last very long, and the median went right back to stagnation. And so I think I'd like to address 2 points that have come up so far. One is about the bottom and one is about the middle. But let me start with the middle class. I think it's, if you go to slide 15, I think it's essential to take this point that Doug talked about the median compensation. That's the blue line there. That grew in lockstep with productivity. They just about doubled between the mid-40s and the mid-70s. And there you see the point that Doug correctly made, which is that median compensation has grown just 9% since the mid-70s to now, while productivity has continued to ascend. Doug and I were having interesting measurement arguments about this this morning. I'm happy to engage on that.
No, you were wrong.
Okay, we're done.
Yeah, no.
Jared, you have opinions, he has facts. Come on,
Yeah,
man.
well, these are facts right in front of you, and there's no doubt. There is no doubt that productivity grew with compensation, and then no longer grew with. I mean, you can see that right in front of you. That those two variables were going together, and then they stopped. So, look. The interesting thing, the thing to understand about this is that I actually believe we do have ways, and I think we may all agree on this, to help boost the bottom. And I'll talk a little bit about those if we get a second. But I think we're much less policy-wise able to implement policies that help the median worker relative to the low-wage worker. We know how to raise the minimum wage. We don't know how to raise the median wage. And here I'd like to just build on something that both Darren and Sarah said. And I want to say something a little controversial. So they talked about structures and systems wherein inequality is embedded. And Darren mentioned education, residential. Garrett mentioned residential segregation. Sarah mentioned difficult neighborhoods. Here's another big institution that is deeply biased against the median worker, and it is the macroeconomy. Now, the macroeconomy works really well in a lot of ways, especially from 40,000 feet, which is kind of where you'd look at a macroeconomy. But in fact, if you look at the period where wages and productivity grew together, or GDP, that was a time when unemployment, the economy was at full employment most of the time. 70% of the time we're at full employment. Since then, we've been at full employment only 30% of the time. The trade balance used to be zero in those years when the median grew with the overall GDP. Since then, the trade deficit has been -2%, -3% of GDP. We have an economy, a macroeconomy, that has inherent structural biases against middle and low-wage workers, because the only way middle-wage workers can get ahead in a non-unionized economy like this is when we have very tight labor markets. And they have been the exception rather than the rule. So I would like to add to Darren and to Sarah's list, and to Garrett's as well, that when you're thinking about structures that we need to deal with if we're going to try to solve this inequality problem, not just for the bottom, but for the middle, we have to bring the macroeconomy into the picture, and particularly persistently slack labor markets and imbalanced trade.
So I happen to know from experience that we could debate this for a long time.
Briefly, I'll be brief.
I want to give, but I said Doug, so I want you to talk about this.
There's nothing I like better than a statistical food fight, but that's not a good use of our time. Let me just say...
They say if you torture statistics long enough, it'll tell you anything you want to hear. But
right, and those are wrong.
They're not wrong.
Wait.
Well, okay.
Let me finish.
Go, but then I get to defend.
Here's the thing. You can get those numbers. I understand it. The productivity is computed with economy-wide. The compensation is not economy-wide. It's a particular class of workers. So if you want to do this right, You should have apples to apples comparisons. And then the two lines are deflated with different price deflators. If you want to know the purchasing power of productivity versus the purchasing power of what people actually get, you should use the same index of purchasing power. So I don't like that chart, but I'm not going to belabor it. But Jared's point is a key point. If you believe that chart's actually right and the macroeconomy is broken, it leads you to a different set of things than if you believe those lines have basically stayed together, as I do, and then you go to a different set of issues. The second part of the statistical food fight is not it's basically in the CBO income data, but it's this. There is no question that beginning in the 80s, the earnings distribution started to widen, and the bottom fell and the top rose. Somewhere in the mid-90s, for reasons that are not entirely clear, the bottom stopped falling, top kept going up. No doubt about it. So if you look at sort of pre-tax earnings, you see this widening. And it's largely rich people getting richer, or more rich people, which you can decide whether you like that or not. I like that. Anyway, second thing is, if you look at post-tax, post-transfer income, far less drama. And if you look at actual consumption data, standard of living, what people get in the way of housing and food and other things, there's basically no movement whatsoever. So there's a lot of statistics out there, but my takeaway from this is that inequality in actual standards of living is not the story. It's the fact that they're too low, and they are chronically low for certain sets of individuals. They're staying there. That's how I end up focusing on the bottom end. Other people read the data differently. They focus more on income than consumption, and they end up in a different place. That's how this fits in here.
So very quick, because I totally agree with Doug that this is not the time for a food fight, but let's argue about this like on my blog or something. It might be fun. Well, okay, I think it might be fun.
Do you want to tell them your blog so they can find it? No,
JaredBernsteinblog.com, and I challenge Doug Holtz-Eakin to a duel on this graph on my blog.
I want to be Burr.
Wait a minute.
I saw that place.
He's on Broadway. He's on Broadway.
I don't accept that challenge. But look, first of all, I definitely don't think the macroeconomy is broken. In fact, I think the macroeconomy works pretty well in this country, especially compared to other advanced economies. What's broken is the distributional function, and what's broken within that is this systemic or structural problem of persistently weak demand from the perspective of the middle class. Look, the fact that the price for machine tools and intermediate goods, the price that you deflate productivity with, is growing more slowly than the price of consumer goods is exactly appropriate in this kind of a figure. People can't eat machine tools. If they could eat machine tools, if they could buy machine tools and live in machine tools, then these two lines would go together. It's actually substantively important that producer prices are growing more slowly than consumer prices.
Alan, can I ask them to put up just briefly slide 5 and let me make a point related to this? So this is a chart that talks about wealth, and let's put the income issues and definitional issues of income aside. And what this shows, in short, is that in the period between 1963 and 1985, you saw about doubling of the median family's level of family wealth, from about 40,000 to 80,000. And you saw in that same period for the 95th, more than doubling. People had about 400,000, then after they had about 900,000 in wealth in that first period. In the second period, 83 to 2013, which is a longer period, for those 3 decades versus 2, however, you saw the 95th percentile double again. But the 50th percentile is essentially in wealth at about exactly where it was before. And if you go to slide 7, what this shows is median family wealth by race and ethnicity. And during those same 2 periods, in 1983, whites had 8 times more wealth than African Americans. But by 2013, that number had gotten to 12. And so And the reason why I focus on wealth as an important piece is if you turn back to social and economic mobility. How do we make it possible for our children to get ahead? Having a little bit of savings that allows you to move somewhere to a new neighborhood that creates more opportunity for your kids, or puts them in a place with more economic integration so they have access to the social and other networks that create opportunity for people. You might invest in a small business or pay for that preschool because we don't have universal preschool in this country. Or you might use those savings to pay for your kids' college education. So if you go to slide 11, which just tells this story, One other aspect about the racial dynamics of this story, it's not the case that the inequality of wealth that people experience in this country is locked in at birth. Certainly, some people have inherited wealth. But when the average family's wealth in their 30s and 40s between African American and white family, the difference is only about 3 times. But over the course of their lifetime, the average American white family continues to make far greater progress than the average American African American family, which means that by the time they're in their late 60s at retirement, the white families have 11 times the wealth of African American families. This brings these consequences of income and savings to the conversation we have about mobility, because this is sort of the building blocks, the things that gives people the ability to make
Okay, so
happen.
this is very powerful stuff, and it was interesting. I saw a recent Federal Reserve study where 47% of the population answering a question where they would come up with $400 for an emergency. 47% of the population said they didn't have any source to get $400. So, and this is what brings now, the cultural aspects and the societal aspects, which I'd like to get back to see if we could focus on. And because of time constraints, I want to maybe get a little narrower and thinking about some things that tie together on some things you just said, and Darren, what you said, criminal justice system you mentioned, Darren. And I think, could we just talk about that for a little bit? Because I think a bunch of things are tied into that as it relates to a racial divide, as it relates to what goes on in neighborhoods where there are a lot of people who are going off to prison. So let's talk about what can we do to make things better? Because that's what we want to try and focus on now. It's not just define the problem, can we define solutions? And so, Darren, could you talk about criminal justice and thoughts you have on what we can do going forward?
Well, I think the challenge here for me, and it's always a treat to be on panels with economists,
I just played one on TV.
Spoken like a true diplomat, Darren.
I will only say that I think the core issue here is that these problems will not be solved unless we are willing to take on the most difficult aspects of our culture as a people, race and class, which are very difficult for we to talk about, certainly to have policy in response. And so focusing on the criminal justice system, we do have a culture in this country, a narrative that in many ways justifies why disproportionate numbers of Black and Latino men are locked up. We have narratives, and those narratives are rooted in our racist history and in the racial hierarchical system that we have perpetuated over generations. And as someone who has benefited and deeply loves my country, because it has provided a poor kid like me with the opportunity to get on that mobility escalator and ride it hard, what I worry about is that we aren't doing that anymore for poor kids like me. And part of the reason we aren't is because we can't really get at the underbelly of these issues. Our criminal justice system is racist at its core. If you read John Ehrlichman's 1984 interview after he was released from prison, and he talked about the origins of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was created, the DEA was created during the Nixon administration as a specific response to the political threat of African Americans. And John Ehrlichman explained how they created a strategy to criminalize African Americans and marginalize their leaders so they would be less effective in the political discourse that was moving against them. We have to embrace that history, because part of that history is why we see these deplorable data. So I think if we're to really address the criminal justice system, the structures, we have to address the schoolhouse to prison house pipeline. We have to understand, why is it the data that Garrett talks about? how can we live in a culture where you actually know more men who look like you, who have gone to prison, than have gone to college? So we've got to address education, and let's start with universal pre-K. What we know from the work of groups like what J.P. Pritzker is doing that has demonstrated the power for poor kids when they have access as early as 1 year old to that kind of intervention. I was in the first class of Head Start in 1965. I will tell you, it changed my life. And so we know what we need to do. We need to focus on pre-K. We need to focus on particular populations, because when you deconstruct the data and you look, for example, at outcomes of urban schools, deconstruct that data. If you take out black boys, that data looks really different. Mm-hmm. Then why don't we focus on black boys? Because we know that if we know where the challenge is, we do this in other phases, other aspects of our society. Let's focus on that. Let's really drive different outcomes for those populations. And we'll see things change.
Our hometown has put in universal pre-K, and I think we're optimistic about that.
Can I just,
Jared?
First of all, all of that was extremely resonant to me. And one of the first things I did when I got here the other day, I had a conversation with Michael Milken, and I mentioned, we were talking about child poverty, and the first thing he talked about was pre-K. So that kind of thinking pervades, I hope, this conference. Could you go to slide 17? I want to connect some of what Darren said, although what I have is just kind of insufficient snapshots of the landscape he just created. But I want to show you how some of this inequality plays out in this dynamic, and I also want to defend the safety net with the slide on the right. On the left, what you see there is, in real dollars, the amount that families in the poorest fifth and the richest fifth spend on enrichment opportunities for their kids. So these are the kind of things that, if you're a middle-class parent like I am, you spend on your children. There's sports, there's arts, there's tutoring, there's vacations, there's books. All that stuff used to be a matter of 4x, was the difference between what high and low income families spent on their kids. Now that difference has climbed to 7x. And I'll note that as that inequality, that gap in the extent to which rich and poor families are investing in their children, that's their private spending. On the public side, particularly in the kinds of neighborhoods that Sarah was talking about, public disinvestment has far exacerbated that problem. Now, one area where we've had more success than I think people realize is in terms of the safety net, which is, I think, written off by conservatives as a hammock or as throwing money at poor people. In fact, the safety net itself has been found to have investment characteristics, longitudinal work that's tracked kids over their lifetime until they've become adults, and compared kids who got, in this case, food stamps, nutritional assistance, with kids who don't, show that they're less likely to be obese, they're much more likely to complete high school, and so on. And this is actually a compelling finding. We find the same thing with Medicaid, we find the same thing with the Earned Income Tax Credit. We're not throwing money at these kids. That's not saying these programs are perfectly designed. We actually, if we look at the outcomes, we're making investments, and I think we have to do a lot more if we're going to try to begin to scratch the problem that we just heard Darren talk about.
But let's do something really radical. Right. So let's stay focused on education, because we all agree how important it is. So let's unshackle poor people from all of the privilege that we all have, that the system is built really to serve us. So let's do some radical things like universal pre-K for young people. For college, let's do some radical things like in legacy programs at elite private schools. According to the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation recent research, 30% of legacy applicants at Harvard were accepted.
Wow.
6% of low-income applicants were accepted. And the other pernicious thing that's happening is that even within the diversity at schools like this, it's more people, kids like mine, kids that I would have, but kids kids who are my other black friends who are successful kids.
Obama's daughter.
Exactly. I mean, so when you go onto a campus today, as I do, and I look around, and I go and speak to a group of African-American students, when I was in college in the 1970s and 80s, we were all, the generation of blacks who were in college then were hard-scrabbled from public housing, started in shotgun shacks like me, et cetera. When I go today, I see kids who are at Dalton and Trinity and St. Albans, and these schools, they don't look like their parents' generation. And so what we're seeing again is the manifestation of inequality even within racial categories. And so for the schools, it's a double whammy because you're getting a legacy and you're getting an African-American kid who doesn't need financial aid. It's a pernicious system that reinforces privilege, even in these ways that have really, really, I think, bad outcomes if you care about social mobility.
So I agree with all that, but I want to, for the sake of time, I want to broaden this conversation a little bit, but just with colleges, because Garrett, you said something, I'm not sure you enjoy being at the adults table when you hear the fighting we're going on here, but you said something about economic segregation on campus, and one of the things I will tell you from my experience in dealing with undergraduates at the university I'm involved with, they said the one conversation you can't have is economic status. You can talk about all other statuses, but students are just so uncomfortable. And there's a view that as we've self-segregated by into this, and where you have these certain neighborhoods are one way, when people don't ever live together and meet each other from different economic strata, that there's no understanding, there's no sense of community. So I'm wondering from your generation's point of view on things like college campuses, are we going to break that down, create a sense of community, or are we going the other way?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to go back to just one piece of Darren's comment first, the majority of the achievement gap in SAT scores is explained by race, not income. And a lot of times the data is not even disaggregated that way. Going back to your disaggregation comment, that the College Board doesn't even report data for low-income minority students. They report low-income students, they report minority students, they don't report both. You know, we have data on thousands and thousands of kids through our programs, and we see that that gap is really twice as wide as anybody thinks it is. In the Oakland schools, for example, only 2% of students score above national averages on the SAT. Most people don't realize that because most Oakland students don't even take the test. But when you look at how few kids are really achieving, even at national average levels, there's much bigger gaps than people realize, and the majority of those gaps are explained by race, and I would argue racism more, just as much as the income inequality piece. And you know, when it comes to college campuses, you know, I do think there is a generational difference from the peers I went to college with versus a generation before. I have a friend who grew up in a very tough rural community in California who said, you know, the majority of my classmates at Stanford who share my ethnicity don't even identify with that ethnicity. And so there's a big generational difference. There's a big generational difference here. And I think maintaining that connection to those who have really climbed the mobility ranks in a meaningful way and sharing those stories and building those relationships, that if we lose those stories and those relationships and those histories, we lose a lot of what makes America great.
So I want to get optimistic. I want to find the things that we can do, whether things and the bold things, as Darren said. So Sarah, housing, right? When you talk about, you know, zip code not being destiny, or there's a line about that you could use that's interesting, but are there things we can do with affordable housing? Are there things we can do to mix affordable housing into wealthier neighborhoods and get more of a sense of community? What in your research, what can we do with housing policy to try to break down some of these barriers that Darren and Garrett are talking about?
Housing is one of the most important, housing policy is one of the most important things that affects where you live, and we've been talking about how where you live reinforces so many of these both the barriers and the opportunities. Another one, just by the way, is our system that has us fund education based on local jurisdictions, so that we have some communities that spend 3 or 4 times per student what other communities spend to educate children, and usually in the inverse of where the additional need for support comes. But our patterns of residential segregation have a history as well. Secretary Fox, Anthony Fox, the transportation secretary, has recently been doing a very brave thing. He's been talking about the ways in which highway sightings had historically played a role in literally physically separating communities, usually communities of color, from other parts of a city, and by creating those barriers, segregating with intent communities from other parts of society, and that had the effect of creating not access to employment, access to opportunity, a broader sense of the community. Businesses didn't locate where people couldn't get to them easily. All of those things reinforced. So that's a structural barrier. Well, one of the things he's talking about is how do we use our highway dollars today to change those patterns. We have a huge need for infrastructure finance right now, and this is interestingly one of the most important housing policies we may have is transportation spending, because it can change the ability to live in mixed income communities, in mixed race communities. The work of Raj Chetty and others suggest to us is one of the most powerful things we can do to create economic opportunity.
So that's, I want to go back on the economic side, because we've talked about if we could get productivity and growth, I think we'd all agree that at least it makes it easier to try and figure out how to slice up an expanding pie than a stable pie, right? Yep. And Sarah just brought up, we're not spending on our infrastructure at a period of time when our interest rates are very low, labor is available in those functions, and it's high return. So on our economic side, let's say there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be spending on infrastructure. What can we do to break the logjam? What's the one thing we do is say, how do we just get this thing going and we could get productivity out of it and growth?
The lowest productivity part of the U.S. economy is the U.S. Congress. So, that's a logjam. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the larger budgetary box that we're in, and I love these moments when we can just do all this stuff, and then you got to go find the money. I mean, the reality is that over the next president's 8 years, we will turn into ever larger deficits, $1 trillion by 2024. Of that, about $750 billion will be interest on previous borrowing, so we're going to be borrowing to pay off previous borrowing. That's a bad top line where it's hard to imagine adding a lot of stuff to it, so you have some tough choices. Inside that, when this has been going on for a long time, we are pushing out the annual discretionary spending. There's no room in the budget for it. We've now codified it with these caps and things, but it was happening anyway. And those are the places where we actually have what the founders saw as the role of government. That's national security, basic research, education, infrastructure, genuine investments. They're getting squeezed out. So we've got a bad top line. We have a bad mix. We have not done anything to address it for quite some time. And the way to think about this and why this is hard is we have tremendous entitlements for the elderly in the United States. It's sort of backwards. If you wanted to entitle someone, it ought to be a child. And then give them the opportunity to build on the capacity they have to be successful and let them take care of themselves in old age. We've got the whole thing backwards, and that becomes the issue.
And I think
I brought my fan.
Here's what I'm going to do this for the lightning round. I just want to go to the lightning round here because we're running out of time, and there's so much knowledge on this panel of you guys. So I'd really like to say in the lightning round, each person, if you want to leave people with what is the one thing you would really say is the most important thing, if you could go out and make it happen tomorrow, what would you drive? And let's just go in order. Darren, where would you start? I know you started with education, but what's the one thing about education you would drive?
Well, I think the one consistent theme here is that each of these interventions requires a recognition of the centrality of race. Whether it's housing policy or education policy or larger entitlements, that issue is at the core of the problem statement. And so to get out of the problem, we have to embed that into the intervention.
And just bring it out and die. But what's the way we do that?
The way we do that is through policy,
Okay.
through legislation, through litigation, through all of the interventions, because we can't pretend. I mean, as I said, we have to start with our history. I mean, there's a reason for low asset wealth in this country, even going back to the minimum wage law, going back to the Social Security Act, where every occupation that a Black held in our economy was exempted. So the notion of a minimum, the reason we have a two-tiered minimum wage system is rooted in that racist history, because those Southern senators, to get Roosevelt to get them to go along, he had to agree that basically Black workers would be exempted from minimum wage, because the original minimum wage for tipped workers was 0. The same for the Social Security Act, the same for the GI Bill. These were the foundations of the assets that many middle-class whites today hold. So we have to redress that.
So I don't know if it's my one answer, but it's one thing that would advance the narrative that both Doug and Darren have advanced. You talk about scarce resources, but the resources that the federal government is already spending in effort to support wealth disproportionately goes to those at the top. And I suspect all of us here would agree that instead of having a mortgage interest reduction or retirement savings incentives that essentially increase the subsidy with the amount of your income or the size of the house, that if instead you made that a progressive subsidy and you made most of the benefit of it at the bottom, you would be able to undo some of the ways in which our historical patterns have created that wealth disparity that I demonstrated before, where people who were disproportionately in jobs without retirement savings opportunities were people of color. People who were disproportionately excluded from neighborhoods through policies, including federal government policies, earlier where there was zoning restrictions, et cetera, that prevented them from moving into neighborhoods where property rose in value. If we were to provide our federal subsidy more equitably to the bottom, we would start to erode those historical patterns that we built through policy in the past.
Garrett, lightning round.
Yeah, so, when we think about countries that have lifted a lot of people from poverty, like China, that we think of things like globalization and adoption of technology. And I think we have an arrogance in the United States that we don't need those things here, that everybody here is adapted from globalization, and everybody has all the technologies because we're the United States. The reality is a lot of people don't. And I think there's a misnomer, particularly in the media, that things that are ubiquitous, they actually aren't in low-income populations. How many low-income neighborhoods don't have a major grocery store, for example? So I think if I were to pick one thing, I would say that we need to stop pretending that the US is exempt from needing globalization and adoption of technology, and take proactive policy steps to move us in that direction.
So I have,
Doug, go.
Sorry.
You get
I thought he went already.
you're in a great area. You get to go last. Doug, one thing.
The dividing line between being
Jared 12
poor
seconds.
and not poor in the U.S. is work. And so we need to be relentlessly pro-work. The design of our social safety nets should support and enhance work. Our cultural norms should support and enhance work. What I would say, I'm an economist, but I would say there's a pretty in the data best practice that every young American should know, which is finish school, get a job. If you then want to get married, then have children. Do it in any other order. You're buying yourself an entry to poverty. Don't do it.
So
Jared.
I'm going to do a lightning round, cradle to grave, including the macroeconomy.
Wow.
Moving to opportunity.
I have some more things to say then.
and this is all paid. I can do this budget neutral. Moving to opportunity, as per Sarah's idea, that can be done at very low cost. Pre-K, as universal pre-K of high quality, which is actually a proposal which has a pay-for attached to it through either a tobacco tax or a financial transaction tax. Raise the minimum wage for low-wage workers. Direct job creation. I agree with Doug on the importance of work, but especially for people who've interacted with the criminal justice system, direct job creation is what we're going to have to do to ensure that those folks can find their way back into the labor market. And then in terms of the macroeconomy, a deep dive into infrastructure. It won't pay for itself. I don't want to go to the laugher place with it, and I take Doug's points about the budget constraints, but it is money very well spent right now.
Well, infrastructure spending, if we don't do it now, we got to do it later.
Exactly.
Anyway, so it doesn't change the curve on it. And I think that's what Doug's saying is if we keep postponing what we have to spend, we're covering up what we don't. I would say in closing, boy, you guys were fantastic. We covered an awful lot of ground. We could have gone deeper on every subject because you guys are prepared to do it. But I think we covered a lot of ground. And the bottom line is it does take a village to deal with this. You know, we do need macroeconomic policies. A lot of things you're talking about economic policy, though, need to be done at the local level, about affordable housing, about universal pre-K, about the way, you know, things are dealt with. A lot of that is in municipalities and local governments. We also need, you know, cultural institutions. We need all sorts of things in our society. Garrett, we need access to technology, you're right, and what's happening on campuses should be pushing more. And the one group we haven't talked about is business. And we really need to see, I think, a way to measure. I think consumers are ready to say, let's measure which businesses are treating their workers fairly, because, you know, it's not only wages, but work rules really matter to the quality of life and the ability of people to know they can take care of health care or child care if they have hours where they know where they're going to work, et cetera. So I believe there's a chance to start to hold business accountable, because the good businesses that want to do that should let them where people should know, because I think consumers would tilt towards those. So as a society, we could deal with it. But I think we've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate everybody's help on this panel. I think you've done a fabulous job, and I want to thank all of you.